Hi everyone. So the last time I made a video reading one of my short stories, I got a really lovely response from some of you. So I thought I would read another one. I've been in quite a gothic mood today. I watched the Phantom of the Opera live stream and I'm currently studying towards a master's degree where I'm studying the Gothic as well. And all of that put me in mind of a story I wrote that is quite gothic. So I thought that would be a good one to read. This one's actually from a Bold Strokes Books anthology. It's got lots of brilliant short stories by lots of brilliant authors in it. It's called Women of the Dark Streets. It looks like this. I think it's probably still available on the Bold Strokes website, so do go and have a look. I recommend all the other stories in it. It came out in 2012, so it's quite old now. The one I'm going to read is called Forget Me Not. And it's set in late-Victorian Nottingham. So those of you that are listening to me read this from Nottingham might recognise some of the settings. So here goes. Ada Faithfull staggered slightly on the uneven cobbles. It could have been a result of losing her footing on the smooth stones, or it could have been the copious amount of rough gin she'd taken. Her skirts dragged to a puddle, growing heavy. Inches of water, mud, and God knew what already soaked up from the hem of the dark green silk. Now night had fallen, the sky a heavy starless blue, the moonlight thin, washed-out illumination. Ada was growing cold. She had left the house without bonnet or shawl, not knowing where she intended to go, but knowing she had to get out into the air where she could breathe. She'd wandered aimlessly, keeping to the shadows, spurning inquiries as to her well-being, and trying to keep the tears from flowing. Her throat ached, with the repressed sobs. She'd wandered around the huge rock on which perched the castle, attempting not to think, just wanting to get away. But there were too many people drinking at the inns around its base, so she turned towards the river. She'd only once been on foot in this part of the city, perhaps twice, but certainly never alone. Oblivious to the nature of the area into which she strayed, she hadn't noticed the eyes watching her from the alleys, had barely noted the stench of rotten humanity filling the air. The houses began to huddle and squat close to each other, leaning as if in conspiracy to trap their residents in their poverty-stricken embrace. She didn't notice where she was until it grew suddenly darker. There were no gas lamps, only the vague flickering of lantern light from some of the windows. Out of the shadows a creature approached her. Staggering, eyes dark hollows in the night, the shape of a wide mouth just discernible. "You're in my patch, love," came the voice, rough and ageless, but definitely female. "I beg your pardon?" Ada blinked, shaken momentarily out of her stupor of confusion and distress. The woman, who was taller than Ada, stepped towards her. Ada realised she should be intimidated, and though her heart beat a little faster, was surprised just how numb she felt. "I do business here, little miss. Sling your hook." Realisation dawned on Ada, and she drew her breath in sharply with the knowledge. "No, I'm not. I mean, you're mistaken. I don't care what you are or aren't. I won't have you here taking my business. Sod off." The woman's breath was in her face, laced with alcohol. "Gin," Ada said. "What? You're not one of them temperance women, are you?" "No. Do you have any?" Ada felt reckless. If this woman could haunt the streets by night lost in the shadows, why not lose herself and her troubles in similar oblivion? "What's it to you?" "I'll buy it." Ada suddenly remembered she had no money. She thought quickly, then her hand went to her left wrist. "With this." Before the other woman's eyes, she held a diamond and ruby bracelet. She'd only been wearing it 2 days, a gift from her fiancé. It felt heavy, binding, and she hated the sanguine rubies. The woman squinted as if she did not completely believe what she was seeing in the darkness. Then she reached up a stubby-fingered hand and grasped it. Ada did not let go. "My gin?" "Pleasure, missy." The woman handed over a glass bottle. It was cold and still over half full, judging from the weight. Ada released the bracelet. The woman turned and hurried away, as if her luck might run out if she lingered for any longer. Ada uncorked the bottle and lifted it to her lips tentatively. The sharp odour of the gin stung her nostrils, and she almost cast it aside, but she wanted to be numb, not to think. If the whore could block out the misery of her life, why could it not work for Miss Ada Faithfull? Gin need not be the comfort of the poor alone, surely. She tilted the bottle and let the gin pour into her mouth. It was bitter and strong. She swallowed, and it was like trying to take down broken glass with the taste of turpentine. But the fire warmed her chest and belly. The sheer recklessness comforted her. This was breaking the rules. She smiled and took another, longer drink. A little unsteady already, Ada looked around her, trying to establish which part of the town she found herself in. To her left, the city climbed a slope to spread along the top of the sandstone escarpment. She could make out the straight lines of the lace factory rooftops, the chimneys of the Shire Hall. Beyond that, she knew, were the respectable merchants' houses, the gas-lit streets. She did not want to return home, but it was an altogether safer place to be than the edges of the narrow marsh slums, where she knew herself to be. Ahead of her, a flight of steps led upwards. Though they were entirely in darkness, she walked towards them, determined to climb out of the stinking slums. Maybe, in a more respectable part of the city, she could find a doorway in which to shelter for a while. The stone stairs were steep and worn uneven. Ada's footsteps sounded loud, echoing from the buildings crowding on either side of her. The gin sloshed in the bottle she carried in her left hand, and occasionally the glass clinked when she caught the brickwork at the side of the steps. The only other sounds were more distant, a whir and clatter from the factories where the machines never slumbered, a dog barking and a shout in the night from the slums below. She was about halfway up when she heard another sound, closer, a rhythm of footsteps in time with her own. Ada paused, listening hard. Nothing. Perhaps the gin was fooling her senses already. She began climbing the stairs again, heart pounding with the exertion and desire to get out of the shadowy passageway and onto the wider, lit street above. She detected the footsteps behind her again and began to panic, sure now she was being followed by some lowlife from the slums, convinced such a man could only intend to ravish her or slit her throat, or both. She climbed faster, breathing hard. Finally she emerged onto the cobbles of the street above, the wide and respectable high pavement, home to several fine dwellings as well as important public buildings. But still, her logic blurred by the gin, she ran. Her muddy skirts flapped heavily around her ankles as her eyes darted for a place to hide from whoever was following her. To her left, high above the pale illumination of the gas-lit street, loomed St. Mary's Church, a medieval edifice, its tower the highest point in the city over which it had watched silently for centuries. A few steps under a wrought iron archway led into the dark churchyard. Ada glanced behind her quickly and, seeing no one watching her, fled up the steps. She followed the flagstones to the back of the church, where it was remarkably close to the warehouse buildings just beyond the churchyard. A tall pointed headstone, pale white in the limited light, drew her attention. Without another thought, she threw herself to the damp grass behind it, screening herself from the path and from anyone on the street beyond. A few deep breaths steadied her slightly, but her hands were still shaking. She uncorked the gin once more and took a long drink, suppressing a cough as it tore at her throat. As the alcohol hit her stomach, she began to feel calmer. Perhaps she'd been mistaken. There didn't seem to be anyone following her now. Or maybe it had merely been someone innocent making their way up the steps behind her. It need not be anything sinister. She peered out from behind the headstone. A dark shadow moved in the street. Ada held her breath, but the shadow moved on, without seeming to acknowledge the existence of the church at all. There was no evidence that whoever it was had been following her. Drawing an unsteady breath, Ada sank back to the ground, her back against the marble headstone. "You're like me." Ada jumped, startled to hear a voice so close. A female voice, remarkably clear in tone. She swallowed hard and wondered if it was the gin tricking her. Glancing around, she saw no one. "You're like me." The same words again, an echo. Ada turned to her left this time, and the mystery was solved. There was a girl in the churchyard. Though it was dark, Ada had the impression of youth. The girl wore a pale-coloured dress, and her skin was nearly as pale. Unlike Ada, she had remembered her headwear and wore a simple pale-coloured cap. She was not finely dressed, but nor was she in rags. Ada took all of this in while doubting her own eyes. Could gin cause hallucinations? Why would there be a girl in the churchyard? I'm Christabel Jessup. You're like me. What on earth are you talking about? Ada was pleased her words sounded to come out of her mouth coherently. It felt like more of an effort than it should have done. You needn't be rude. We're alike. What's your name? Ada Faithful. A moment later, Ada wondered why she'd revealed her name. Why are you in a churchyard? Why are you? I asked you first. Ada's eyes were growing accustomed to the level of light in the churchyard. The girl was pretty. Even through the haze of the gin, Ada couldn't help being a little intrigued. It was oddly comforting not to be alone in her misery. I'm hiding. What from? The same as you. In that case, have some gin. Ada offered the bottle, but Christabel refused it. I never touch it. Me either. Ada shrugged and, feeling a little pathetic, took another, shorter drink. She placed the bottle on the damp grass beside her. As she waited for the burning in her throat to calm, she looked at the girl. She had a vague perception that the gin was rendering this whole encounter less bizarre than it really was. So how am I like you? She said, hearing the challenge in her words. You've given your heart to a woman. Ada drew in her breath sharply, the fog in her mind clearing quickly. Her heart pounded and she felt almost fearful. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid that this strange girl knew her truth, or that there was such a truth to be known and spoken of. She had never spoken of it, barely acknowledged it before now. Why, was all she could manage in response. I know. You're like me. You mean you have given your heart? Well, yes. Lillian Fields. She's fair, tall, and so alive. So very much alive. Ada felt wistful suddenly, hearing the love and desire in Christabel's clear tone. She sighed and felt keen eyes regarding her face. Her name? What's her name? The girl you love. Ada looked away, up at the square tower of the church, a tall shadow against the night sky. Maud. Maud Hutton. She's the daughter of my father's business partner. Maud was beautiful. Her hair was raven and fell in long waves when loosed from its usual tight braids. Her face was strikingly angular but graceful with it, and she had the most articulate voice. She was the most articulate woman Ada had ever encountered. She had been enthralled on their first meeting, and she was sure she was unaccountably in love by the end of their second. The greatest surprise of it all had been when she had begun to recognise that Maud had returned those secret feelings. But Ada was engaged to Jim Collett, a man her parents approved of and whom she did not hate, but yet could not love. She'd agreed to marry him mostly out of pity, she thought, for he was rather a shy, awkward man who would smile rather than speak, and always seemed in fear that he would let everyone else down. Besides, she was not sure if her love for Maud was even real. How could it be? And yet once she had given her consent to the marriage, she felt as though she had begun to drown, slowly, slipping further under the surface every day. Finally, tonight, her need to breathe had caused her to run from the house just as dinner was about to be served. Maud was to be present at the dinner, to sit opposite her, to exchange glances that said more than impotent words, to be so close to her and yet only have a heart full of questions and doubts. A knowledge of the impossibility of it all was too much to bear. Just to see Maud in the soft candlelight of the dining room caused a pain in all of her body, and she seemed incapable of soothing it. Is she beautiful? Ada was recalled to her present situation in the cold churchyard with the strange girl by her side. Yes, she began dreamily, tempted to launch into a description of Maud. Then she stopped herself. This was too preposterous, even with half a bottle of gin in her belly. But why do you care? Why am I telling you? Why are you even in this churchyard in the middle of the night? I have more reason than you to be here. How's that then? Would you like to hear a story? Ada was suspicious for a moment of such an odd question, but the gin and her lack of desire to return home were enough to produce an affirmative response. Yes, I'm intrigued, she acknowledged. Oh, good. Christabel's excitement was almost childlike. She hunched across the grass to move closer to Ada, their skirts brushing. To Ada's surprise, Christabel took her hand between both of her own. Christabel must have been in the churchyard a long time, for her skin was very cool to the touch. Ada let her hand rest where Christabel grasped it lightly, the strangeness of the night making her more permissive than she would otherwise have been. There was once a young girl. They said she was pretty and would marry well, though she wasn't especially rich. A lace merchant's daughter she was. But she didn't wish to marry, and they began, eventually, to think her rather queer. There was another girl, a little older, very tall and with fair hair, but handsome more than pretty. She was a milliner, a very fine one at that. Her fingers were nimble, and she had an eye for what suited every face. She made, for the lace merchant's daughter, the most beautiful bonnet she had ever seen. It was trimmed with lace and the most graceful feathers. Christabel paused and sighed. She turned and appeared to be inspecting Ada's appearance. She moved one hand from Ada's and reached up to her face, running a cool fingertip lightly from her temple to her chin. Compelled by something in that touch, Ada allowed it, despite herself, and found she missed it when Christabel drew her hand away. Beautiful it was. It would have suited you. Was it your bonnet? Ada asked, beginning to see where the story was leading. Christabel placed a gentle but commanding finger onto Ada's lips. It tickled pleasantly. Hush, and I will tell you. Ada obeyed as Christabel took her hand between her own again. This time her soft touch was welcome, and Ada was glad of it as she waited for the story to go on. The lace merchant's daughter loved her bonnet, but before long she loved the milliner more. The whole world seemed to make sense to her then, and it barely seemed a surprise that the milliner loved her back. Christabel leaned closer to Ada, who found her heart beating faster. She could feel Christabel's breath on her cheek, and it sent a shiver through her whole body, making her skin prickle. The love between two women is a wonderful thing, Christabel said, her words charged with passion, though still soft. But then, you know that, do you not? Her hand stroked over Ada's face again, turning her so they were looking into each other's eyes, but still not quite seeing in the darkness. Ada knew she should move away, could no longer blame the gin for her reluctance to do so. So long now she had wanted this close proximity with a woman, to feel those soft lips against hers. Christabel was not Maud, but Ada had not kissed Maud, only imagined how it could feel. She could smell Maud, that vague trace of violet she always wore, and, closing her eyes, see those blue eyes looking into her own. She kept her eyes closed, and her lips tingled with a desire that seemed to be growing into a craving, as Christabel's own lips promised to brush hers, as she continued to speak in what was now a throaty whisper. You know what it is to love a woman. You know what those two lovers felt. And they did love. In the dark hours of the night they would lie together, knowing nothing could be more perfect, more pure than the love they shared. Such passion, so deep it was almost a pain. Christabel's hand slid over Ada's jaw, lower onto her throat, where Ada felt her pulse throb against the slight pressure. Lower still, and her hand was caressing Ada. Ada's eyes closed, and she sighed. It was Maud's touch she felt, and she was captivated by it. She felt the burning pain of Christabel's words, and heat surging low in her body. Everything that had seemed so wrong, that had caused her to accept Jim's proposal as some sort of act of contrition, felt suddenly pure and powerful and right, as Christabel caressed her and their lips touched for the slightest of moments. They were very much in love, the lace merchant's daughter and the milliner. But they knew the world would scorn them. They swore very solemnly they would always be together, that this one brief passing life was too small for such love. Little did they know how fleeting their moment would be. Christabel ran a hand up Ada's spine to caress the back of her neck and twine in her unruly hair. Ada sighed. The other hand Christabel slid lower, pressing Ada, and now she moaned. With the building desire, the frustration she felt every time she looked at Maud. Maud filled her head. Though she knew it was another girl, Christabel, to whose words she listened, all she could think of was Maud. Maud's slim fingers touching her, just as she had always dreamed. She reached desperately for Christabel, drew her to her with all of the force she longed to use with Maud, and kissed her a deep, exploratory kiss as she drew Christabel close, needing to feel her close to her. She felt the swell of her body against her, felt the curve of her waist in her grasp. She smelled violets again. Maud. "Oh, yes, yes, my love, this is how it should be." Christabel paused back, but pulled back slightly, gasping for breath. There was pure joy in her tone. "You are like me, Ada Faithful." Ada pushed forward, compelled by an urge she couldn't understand, but was powerless to resist, to kiss Christabel again, to taste those soft lips once more. She was hungry, and she felt she wanted to consume the other woman. She wanted to kiss Maud until her lips were bruised. But Christabel drew her. Christabel held back, just allowed Ada the slightest brush of her lips. Ada was aware of the hot tears streaming over her cheeks, but she could neither stop them nor explain them. Christabel kissed her softly, then spoke again. "But, my love, do you not want to hear the end of the story? Tell me." Ada was breathless and aching, full of a desire she had never known before. The lace merchant's daughter and the milliner swore they would spend there forever together. They declared that if one should die, the other would surely follow, consumed by grief. Christabel and Lillian would never be divided, for neither of them would be able to bear life or the cold eternity of death without the other. "I understand," Ada breathed, thinking still of Maud. Her heart was singing at her final realization of how much she loved Maud. She could not live without her. She would tell her so the first chance she got. "I understand. Forever, together." "I knew you were like me. You understand forever." There was something darker, a sadness in Christabel's tone. Ada felt it as a weight in her own heart. A life is not long enough, however long it is lived. It is over so soon. But to make the most of each moment. "Yes, my love, to know what it is your heart desires and to follow it, to grasp a tight hold of it." Christabel grew restless, her hands moving more quickly over Ada's body. Ada felt herself respond. She was approaching a crisis of her passions, and the sensation pulsed through her veins in waves, molten hot. I know what it is I want," Ada replied. Maud filled her mind. "You can have it. I can give it you, my love. Forever with me." Ada tensed, suddenly fully aware of Christabel. This was not Maud, and Christabel's voice had taken on a strange tone. "No. You are going to spend your forever with Lillian. I have my Maud, and I'm going to find her tonight." "She will leave you. She will spurn you and leave you to be alone." Christabel spat the words at Ada with real venom. Jolted out of her illusion, Ada was now afraid. "Is that what happened to you? With Lillian?" she inquired. "You didn't hear the end of the story yet," Christabel said. "Tell me." "The lace merchant's daughter was taken ill. She was never very strong. She died." Ada gasped at the wave of sadness that overtook her. Her mind was racing to understand and failing. "But I thought I was the lace merchant's daughter." "Yes." "I was. I don't understand." Was Christabel a mad woman after all? Ada backed away slightly, but could not quite break the spell. Something pulled her to Christabel. Christabel seemed to be smiling. As Ada watched, she faded. The solid woman began to fade. Skin, pale in the darkness, became suddenly translucent until Ada could see the outline of a headstone a few feet away through Christabel's body. Wide-eyed, her heart hammering, Ada did not scream. She stared. Christabel was still there. She could still feel her, but now she could barely see her. She was a mist in the form of a woman, a wisp of white in the dark. A ghost. Compelled by a logic she did not control, Ada turned to look back at the headstone against which she had been leaning. White stone with black engraved letters. Even in the night she could read the name. Christabel Ann Jessup. She couldn't make out the words below, but the date stood out very clearly. 1861 to 1880. Christabel Jessup had been dead for 10 years. "You're dead." She spoke the words through the white haze in front of her. Try as she might, she did not feel afraid. Indeed, she did not even doubt her own sanity. How could she not accept what she saw with her own eyes? In moments, Christabel was solid again, looking at Ada with hollow eyes. "I am lost in forever, and I am alone." Christabel's voice was full of pain. "You're like me. You can be with me." "Is that what you thought? That you could seduce me into eternity with you?" "You wanted to be with me." Christabel sounded so plaintive that Ada could not help a swell of sympathy. "What of Lillian?" "She lived. She let me go on into forever on my own. She visited my grave for a while, but then life's currents drew her away. When it is her turn to come to this side, she will never find me. I am lost. But you could share this with me." Surely I would have to die to do so. The notion sparked real fear in Ada's stomach. Would Christabel attempt to keep her by any means? Her life seemed suddenly so precious to her. Death is really nothing. Just a moment and it is over. It is what you must leave behind and what you find on the other side you should fear, not death. I don't want to die. I love Maud. She is human. She is fickle and will change her mind. If you should die, will she follow you into forever? I would not expect it. This life is enough. Shared with her, whatever we face. A new joy surged in Ada's heart as she spoke of her convictions, as she was only now aware of them. She would not marry Jim. Even if they had to leave home, leave the city, she would find a way to share her life with Maud. She would not be Christabel. She would not be a ghost herself while she was alive, and she would not spend eternity in sadness. She would live every moment well enough to die happy, knowing she had loved. This life is short, do you not see? It is perilous. I can give you love, always. Christabel reached out a cold, pale hand. Ada let her grasp her own warmer fingers, but she shuddered. I am not your Lillian, and you can never be my Maud. I am sorry, Christabel, but I will take my chance with life. I am like you, and I will live my life how you wanted to live yours. Christabel's eyes widened and her grasp of Ada's hand tightened. Death is cold, Ada. I am alone here. Ada felt the sadness creeping up her arm, a chill spreading into her body. Tears sprang into her eyes. To slide into death with Christabel seemed a real possibility. She fought it, clinging to her love for Maud, her new hope. Remember your life with joy. You knew love. In moments you have shown me how important that is. Rest, Christabel. Have faith in your Lillian. She will find you. What if she does not? Ada could not fight the tears. She pulled Christabel closer, brushed a gentle kiss on the cold lips. She will find you. Rest. You will go to your Maud. You will love her with every breath. I will. I promise. Christabel reached for another kiss. Ada allowed it. She closed her eyes and prayed to anyone who would listen that love was as powerful as she craved it to be. When she opened her eyes, Christabel was gone. Ada lingered a while in the dark churchyard, her eyes filled with tears, but her heart surging with hope, determination, and joy. She would fight if fight she must, but Maud had to know the extent of her love. She took the walk home through the dark streets quickly, her head aching a little in the aftermath of the gin, the remainder of which she discarded. In the back of her mind there was a slight fear, a vague doubt that Christabel had been a figment of a gin and distress-turned brain, and she'd actually spent the past hours in a churchyard alone, drunkenly muttering to herself. A ghost. It seemed so ludicrous as she walked, more or less sober, back through the respectable residential streets to her home. And yet the doubts were so easy to push away. Christabel had seemed so real. The emotions were so real. Even if it had all been a drunken delusion, Ada would not undo it. She saw now the path she wanted to take into the future. All traces of the distress that had caused her to run alone and frightened into the night, to want to lose herself in gin, had faded. Maud was her future, and she would seize every living, breathing moment. The next morning, after a few hours of sleep more peaceful than she thought possible, Ada, now respectably attired and complete with bonnet, shawl and gloves, walked to St Mary's churchyard. She skirted the slums rather than passing through them, and instead of gin from a horse she bought blooms from a flower seller. She took sweet peas to bid farewell, and rosemary to remember. She climbed the stone steps into the churchyard, glancing briefly at the square tower, a honey-sweetened grey in the sunlight, which glinted from the stained glass of the intricate windows and filtered down into the shadows of the churchyard. Ada went straight to the pointed white headstone. There were Christabel's name, and the dates of her short life. Tears pricked Ada's eyes again, but then something arrested her vision. Stars of blue in the grass. Ada smiled. Forget-me-nots. She remembers you, Christabel. Sleep. Wait for her. She barely whispered the words. And I will love my Maud. Because of you. The end. I hope that wasn't too scary a ghost story, everybody. Thank you for listening. Please leave me comments if you liked it, and I will see if I have any other nice stories to read to you. Good night, everybody.